Excellent. So welcome everybody. We are going to kick off now. Hopefully a few more people will join us. But welcome everyone to Volac's Lambing with Lamlac 2023. I'm Sam Sampson and I'm the product manager for young animal nutrition here at Volac. We've got some guest speakers here to get your lambing season off to a strong and healthy start. But first of all, I think it should be automatic, but please ensure your microphones are on mute throughout. And any questions you've got, you can add to the chat or you can send them direct to me using the panel on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen. There will be time for questions at the end, and any that we don't get to or that you'd like us to follow up on, you can get in touch directly by emailing lambing@volac.com, or of course you can get in touch via Facebook, Twitter, all of the usual channels. So today's agenda is going to kick off with Wedge Jones. On my screen, he's up here in the top right-hand corner. He's a vet currently working at the University of Glasgow, and he'll be covering all things colostrum. And then we're going to hear from Jason, Volac's business manager in the north, who'll be covering practical lambing and ensuring that those surplus lambs are bringing in their return. Dr. Jessica Cooke will be going through the latest research on Lamlac, so you can see why it's the tried and trusted performer for over 50 years. And then we've got Howard Gilbert, who you currently can't see, but you should have a screen full of sheep. He is live on farm to cover off top tips for lambing and show you how Cherry's farm, just outside of Chelmsford in Essex, get through their lambing season. They have great growth rates and they're using the Volac Adlib Eco Feeder. Howard is actually supported today by Josh Sugg, who's in charge of all the technology, and we've done our very best, but I'm sure everybody in this call can totally understand that technology is technology, and they are on the outskirts of Essex in a lambing shed, so do please be patient if there's a bit of a lag on videos. All of our speakers will be hanging on right until the end to answer any of your questions as well. But before we kick off, I'm just going to give everybody a brief introduction into who Volac are. So Volac are a family-owned company based just outside of Cambridge, which is where I am at the moment. I'm in head office. However, we are a global company with technical hubs, commercial interests and manufacturing all across the globe. So all of us here today, with the exception of Reg, who's joining us from the University of Glasgow, are here from the animal nutrition division of Volac. However, Volac do also manufacture protein that goes into the sports nutrition industry, so into sports drinks, protein powders, that sort of thing. So all of the young animal milk replacers that we manufacture are produced using British whey, which we take from the cheese manufacturing process, and that's all done locally here in GB. This liquid whey is then processed and dried at our plant in West Wales, which you can see there's a picture of amongst the Welsh hills. Now, this produces a high concentrated protein base, which makes up all of our milk replacers, whether that be lamb or calf. Now, these two pictures here you can see are from our spray dryer. So the liquid it goes through there and it's dried at a really low temperature to ensure high quality milk powder. Now, Jason's going to cover that off a little bit more later on, but just for scale, this picture here on your left-hand side is part of our spray dryer. Now, that's actually 5 stories high, so you can see that you know, it's a really big piece of kit. The way in which we manufacture is totally unique, and it does result in our milk replacer having a balanced amino acid profile, which is perfect for the development of young lamb. It also allows Lamlac to be mixed cold, as well as helping to keep it in suspension. You know, whenever we're raising these lambs, a lot of the time you mix up a litre of milk and you might need to pop it in the fridge or something for a few hours. Something I am going to cover off here is just a very quick note on sustainability. So no doubt it's an incredibly important subject, especially within the agricultural industry at the moment, but something we're not shy about, and we are really proud of the credentials in which we have regarding this particular raw ingredient is we do use palm oil. We use palm oil across quite a few of our products, whether that's our rumen protected fats or our young animal milks. Now, all of the palm oil and palm oil derivatives that Volac source come from sustainable sources. Now, this is to help secure a future for communities and the environment, but our palm products are either RSPO certified or NDPE. Now, NDPE is something a lot of people aren't that familiar with. It means no development on peatland, no deforestation, and no exploitation of people. We're heavily audited on our supply chain, as you can imagine. But something that we are trying to be really clear about is that palm is the most efficient oil crop available, and it's also perfectly balanced to support the young calf nutrition. So if anybody has any questions on Volac's palm policies, you can find the answer to that on volac.com, or you can feel free to email lambing@volac.com and ask me any questions about that. But in addition to the sustainable industry and the use of sustainable raw ingredients, we also want to help our farmers to nurture an efficient flock or herd, if we're talking about dairy in that case, as well as to build a sustainable business, which is why we're here today to hopefully offer you some tips and tricks to help you get through lambing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I wonder if Josh and Howard wanted to show us what was going on in farm while Wedge queues up his slides, ready to talk to you about colostrum. Howard, how are you getting on just outside of Essex?
Good morning, sir. How are we doing? Well, it's afternoon here, you can tell, even in the east of England. We're here, for those of you that know the eastern counties, we're on the outskirts of Chelmsford. Just down the road, it said Marconi first invented his radio waves, and certainly they built the first radio transmitters down there. I wonder what he'd make of the fact that I'm able to talk to you live now. Let's have a look around here. We're on the Speakman family farm. As I said, they farm just outside Chelmsford. They have a very organised approach to their lambing. In less than a month ago, there were 500 ewes here waiting to lamb. If you scan onto this side, all that's left are these few here. So in under a month, they've lambed nearly 500. They sponge. It's a technique that they've used for the last 4 or 5 years, and they're refining that technique. They tell me now they worked in 2 batches of 200 and 250. Next year, they'd like to work in 3 of 150. It's a technique that works really well for them. But as you can see around here, this isn't typical of every lambing shed, but my word, they're organised in order for this to happen. You can see all the twins, singles, triplets, all portioned up. But I'm delighted to say that one of the consequences of the very dry weather that we've had in East Anglia and across Britain, particularly in February, has meant that turnout's been really easy. Weather has not been an issue. It's been dry and not too cold. So lambs and ewes have been able to be transported out. And in common with what I suspect is the rest of the national herd, numbers born here have only been average. The scanning has matched what was predicted, and we're possibly on a typical year, maybe 10–15% down on what we might be expecting. But as always, the cycle goes on, and I'd love to have shown you this slide. Half an hour before we dropped out.
I think that range might be a bit ambitious.
Rather large for an eagle. She's happy, they're happy, they're off. Life should be good for these two from now on. And as I said, all that remains is this little assembly. These ladies will be round any time in the next couple of days, maybe even sooner. Certainly when they were busy here, there would be as many, sometimes 50, even 80 some nights of lambing here. But it means that lambing is all at the same time. The farm can focus totally on doing lambing as well as they can, and they do it very well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction, Howard. We're going to come back to you again between speakers and then later on after Jessica's been through her research. So, Reg, over to you.
Oh, hope you can all hear me here. Thank you very much for inviting me here, Sam. It is a pleasure to present for Volac. My name is Rheinallt Jones, but everybody knows me as Reg because nobody can say my name. And I'm a farm animal veterinarian and a nutritional researcher based at the University of Glasgow. So today we're going to cover, start off with a brief introduction on what we mean when we're speaking of colostrum management. What influences colostrum production, what's actually in colostrum, because it's not just antibodies, and why that's important as well. And finally, how much should we be aiming for, and how do we know if we've succeeded in our colostrum management? So you may have come across or heard of the 3 Qs of colostrum management. These are an easy to remember checklist of what we aspire our colostrum management to look like. We need good quality colostrum, which is ingested in sufficient quantity and in a timely manner, so that is quickly. But in recent years, this has expanded to include a couple of other things. It's expanded to include quite clean, and we know that Q is a bit of a stretch here, but it is very important, especially if we're the ones providing the colostrum to newborns. The state of the equipment that we use to store and feed colostrum, especially if dirty, can have a knock-on effect on neonatal health. And finally, quantification. If we've gone to all the trouble of tackling the first 4 Qs, then it's best if we can check that it's all been worth it and the lambs have received the right amount of colostrum at the end of the day. So many of us at the moment are about to start lambing or are just in the middle of lambing. However, it's still good to know of the factors which influence colostrum quality and quantity, in case we can make some last-minute tweaks. From around a month pre-lambing, the udder demands energy, and it demands this on an increasing scale for that month, as it enlarges and begins to produce colostrum and milk. In the week immediately pre-lambing, this process ramps up further, resulting in the udder having huge demands for energy and protein. Now, if these energy demands aren't met, as we sometimes see in late pregnancy because of the reduction in abdominal space, and this resulting from obviously an increase in the size of the uterus because of the fetuses that are in the uterus impinging on kind of the rumen. Now, when the nutritional demands aren't met, we see a reduction in a post and a pre and post production of colostrum and milk. And we see a delay in milk production in general, so we might see ewes that are quite slow to come to milk. And we see an increase in colostrum viscosity. So this is an increase in how thick the colostrum is, making it quite difficult for the lambs to actually suckle the colostrum out of the udder. However, other factors also affect colostrum quality and quantity. We tend to see an increase in both colostrum quality and quantity as the dam ages, and with how many pregnancies she's had. Very fat or very thin ewes will have a slight delay in milk production, so may have poorer quality and quantity by the time the lambs are born. Production is also heritable, so some lines of or family lines of sheep might be better producers. And even the fetus can affect colostrum production, with ewes carrying multiples having slightly delayed production, and animals carrying solely male fetuses producing better or more colostrum. Now, during this last month of pregnancy, it isn't simply fat, protein and carbohydrate that's pushed into the udder. We've all probably heard about immunoglobulins. These are the antibodies that the ewe has mounted against all the diseases and the vaccinations that she's encountered or been given on farm. Now, she gifts these to the lambs through the colostrum, as the lamb hasn't got any antibodies when it's born. But these are but there are many other compounds and chemicals which play an important role in lamb development. Things like hormones, enzymes, minerals, and even antimicrobials and anti-inflammatories, which are included in the colostrum. So if we've got good quality colostrum and it's fed to lambs in a sufficient quantity in a timely manner, which includes all of these previously pointed out chemicals, then we would expect lambs to perform fairly well. We would expect lambs to have an adequate amount of antibodies and other immune molecules, which will hopefully reduce disease incidence and increase survival to weaning. Lambs should be better able to keep warm, and therefore we should see less cases or fewer cases of hypothermia. They're less likely to be rejected or left by their mothers. Calves have been shown to have better health outcome and are better at growing to weaning. And adequate colostrum production also helps with the maturation of the gastrointestinal tract. And this is really important if we want to make the most out of any milk or creep feed that we'll be feeding these lambs subsequently. And there is even some evidence that says that good quality colostrum affects the male and female reproductive capacity in later life. Now, we hope that lambs and their mothers will be able to take care of themselves, but this is not always the case. Often lambs often the lambs that we end up artificially rearing will have been removed soon or just after birth. And given the investments that we're making in these lambs to raise them, it's essential that we get their colostrum management right. So we need to provide the right amount of colostrum, and this is dependent on the amount of energy the lambs will need to keep warm. Wet and cold lambs will need about 50% more colostrum than warm and dry lambs in the first about 18 hours of life. So a warm and dry lamb will need around 200 mils per kilogram body weight in the first 18 hours of life, and a wet and cold lamb will probably need about 300 mils per kilogram body weight in the first 18 hours of life. And this should be fed in kind of 3 aliquots. We should be aiming to feed about a quarter of that as soon as we possibly can. And then the next quarter within 6 hours of birth, and the rest within 18 hours of birth. And this timing is key as the intestines, which are initially leaky, begin the process of closing soon after the lamb has taken its first feed. And by 24 hours, the large beneficial chemicals in colostrum can't pass from the intestine into the lamb's system. And finally, how do we measure success? We know that there is an association between how much antibodies there is in colostrum and how much antibodies end up in the lamb's blood system, in the lamb's system. And we can measure both of these indirectly on farm using a Brix refractometer, which measures the total solids in fluid. Although you'll need to ask a vet to take a blood sample from the lambs between 1 to 7 days old to check the lamb's antibody levels. This test can be used to assess the ewes as a group, asking, have I managed these ewes in a way that promotes good colostrum production? And the lambs as both a group and individuals, asking if we've managed the lambs in a way that promotes colostrum consumption, and has this particular lamb failed to consume enough colostrum in this instance. The table at the bottom here gives cutoff values for good colostrum and good immunoglobulin transfer, so good Brix refractometer measurements for lambs in the first 7 days after birth. So that's me ended a little bit about colostrum. Hopefully that has been useful for you. I'd like to thank Volac for inviting me here today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, I've certainly learned a chunk there. So everybody, just to remind you, please do pop any questions you've got in either to the chat or Q&A function. If you go over to the right-hand side of your screen, there should be some icons at the bottom for that. So thank you very much, Reg. Now, I have been told I will be receiving a video live from farm for us to play shortly. But while Jason gets his slides ready to cover off about these surplus lambs rearing, Josh and Howard, what's going on farm? Sorry, Jason, if you could just hold off sharing for 1 minute. If we can buzz back live on farm, shall we see how we can get on there?
Ready to go? Yes. Okay.
Oh, it's outside.
Sam, welcome back. Hope everybody's okay. We've just been out to look at the ewes out on pasture. And we're going to go back inside now. Lambs and ewes are doing really well. That's a great thing with the weather having been as dry as it is. That's good. But let's get ourselves back inside. See what's going on.
Josh, I hope you've got your running shoes on to keep up with
One of the
Howard.
features that Sam pointed out earlier was here at Cherries, they make really good use of the extra lambs that they have by putting them onto a defined system for rearing. Very evident over there. walk back through these nearly empty sheds. It's almost done here. I know for many of you on the Volac Lambing has hardly started. I hope it goes really well. I hope it goes as well as it's gone here. See, really well-defined rearing area. The key to it all is this feeder over here, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But while we're stood here, have a look at this pen. This is the main pen. I think there's 43 in here at the last count. As the camera scans round, you'll see all that's good in a rearing pen. You'll see there's plenty of room. The feeding teats are all at one end. Now remember, the lambs will always go to the teat, so you don't need to chase them with it. And you can see here, we've got a marvellous setup. We're way over spec. If anyone ever asks you, we have always reckoned it's one teat to every 10 lambs. And you can see we've got a mix. The red teats, I'm happy to confirm, are slightly harder rubber than the white, but we've got a mixture here. But you can see they're set nicely off the ground, so the lamb lifts its head when it drinks. And if you have a look at the back here, and our man Josh will come round and show you, this is the correct way to set up your pipe work. A short run from the back of the teat to the non-return valve. That non-return valve stops the milk dropping too far, so that when the lamb drinks, it can pull the milk easily through. But what's crucial, for these to work, they need to be hanging down. They shouldn't be upright, or otherwise they won't work. The little ball bearing in them won't have any effect. If they're folded down like this, you can 2 into 1, 2 into 1, 2 into 1. The angle is right on these. These will work effectively. And you can see how it's, like spaghetti junction. You can work your way back all the way along here. You can see there's more here. These lambs are really well spec'd. And you can see from them, look how well they're growing. The beauty of this system is that the lambs can come up and snack feed. They can feed whenever they want, same way that they would do if they were on the ewe. And this is why such a bonus on this scheme is the growth rates. It saves an enormous amount of labour, but the real bonus is how well these lambs grow when milk is provided for them whenever they need it. It's always the same. It's always the same temperature, always the same consistency. No problem at all for them to come and drink. And you can see here, settled comfortably. They've all had the breakfast, they've had lunch. They can come and snack feed whenever they want. And I just want to focus a little bit more, if I may, on this pen layout. There's several things that are so right here. We've got a bale of straw for them to play on if they need it. They can nibble straw. And you and I know these as footballs. The modern parlance is enrichment, but they've got balls that they can play with. They've got plenty of space. They've got a large creek feeder in the middle. This is ideal because it allows access from all sides. There's not too much in there at a time, so that the food is always fresh. And here on the side, we've got some water. Really important this, if you want your lambs to start taking dry feed, and it's a crucial part of this system, because while they're drinking milk on an ad lib basis, they won't really want to eat much dry feed. And the trick to getting them to eat dry feed is to make it fresh, little and often, not too far from the feeding teats, but also provide them with plain water. That milk isn't the same as water, in the same way that for those of you that want to do it, you'll know how important a glass of water is with your lunch or your supper. It's the same for lambs. If we want them to eat their dry feed, we need to provide fresh water. This will be changed at least twice a day. They'll always have fresh water. And lo and behold, it's fascinating to see how interested they are in straw. Even though they're young lambs, we've noticed this morning in the short time we've been here, how regularly they'll pick this straw up. And you can see they can choose, they've got plenty of space, they can choose where they lie. It gets cleaned out regularly, so no one area gets too damp. Works really, really well. Shelter from the wind, on the sun, when the sun does shine in the east, it'll come nicely through these doors. It's a lazy wind here today. It's cold. I put my hat on. I didn't have it to start with, but it's one of those days. Now if we move down to the feeder,
Howard, I think we're going to...
We've got
Howard, we
small
need to get...
training pens here for when lambs first come onto the feeder. These lot have all passed their training. These are learning. Hopefully there won't be too many more from the remaining 9 that will complete the flock for this year. But I think the team here are hoping that by the weekend, most of these will all be done and lambing for another year will be over.
Brilliant. So we are going to move on, Jason, if you wanted to get on and share your screen, and then we're going to come back to Howard again after Jessica. Thank you very much. Jason, over to you.
Let's take myself off of mute before I share my screen. Will be helpful. Is that okay at your end, everybody? Yep.
Yep, please carry on.
So good afternoon and welcome everybody. My name's Jason Short and I'm a business manager in the north of England, up in the hills of Northumberland. So plenty of sheep in front of me where I live, in front of my office. So I'm going to start off and talk about how we manufacture milk. Going to talk a little bit about rearing costs and setups, and then we'll come on to sort of finishing off and top tips and reiterate sort of some of the things that Howard has touched on there. So starting off, looking at our manufacturing plant in West Wales. This is a picture across the fields of Volac. This is where we process our liquid whey, and we bring that in from the cheese manufacturing plants around the UK. We utilise roughly about 50% of the available whey, and we bring this in a concentrated form into our factory in Volac. We then, on the next slide, we'll cover in a little bit more detail, but we then make human whey nutrition products along with our young animal nutrition milk replacers. So looking at the manufacturing plant, as Sam has already touched on the left-hand side here, that dryer sits through the plant and is roughly about sort of 5 stories high. So what we do is we bring the liquid whey in tankers, put it into silos, and then using membrane technology, we do ultra nano microfiltration, and then we separate the protein, the fat, and the lactose or the sugar. So we separate those off into separate streams. We demineralize it, we delactose it, we take the water out. Those 3 products then get dried, and we end up with a concentrated dairy protein with a high immunoglobulin content, which is then linked back to sort of being able to produce a milk powder that has a high amino acid profile, which is good for growing lambs and things like that. And then what we do is we take those 3 products and then we take it into spray dry. Also, we take the liquid, we put it through the spray dryer. We end up with the three streams, and then we blend, adding vitamins and minerals, and then we end up with a finished milk replacer. A good quality finished milk replacer that is superior in quality. It's got high amino acid profile, is a very palatable product, is very consistent in the way that it is made and manufactured. It's been touched on already that we would be looking at, or we've got a milk powder that can be mixed in cold water, and that is down to our unique sort of manufacturing and our processes that we do over in the factory. So looking at the newborn lamb, Reg has already touched on a few things and the importance of colostrum, but why the newborn lamb and why it's very vulnerable to infection is when it's born, its antibody status is negligible. It's has an immature gut lining and can allow bacteria and toxins into the bloodstream, has slow gut movements during the first day of life until that colostrum has been fed, and then that pushes it through. So we can see on the left-hand side of the table, and I'm sure you're all aware that lambs would be very susceptible to hypothermia. Now that can be one of 2 things. So that can either be hypothermia due to starvation. A lamb's total energy reserve is only about 3% of its body weight, and proportionately a 4-kilo lamb has 3 times more skin than that of a 60-kilo yow. Lambs that perish from hypothermia when more than 6 hours old is basically due to starvation. So So then we know the extremes of weather that we get, and we'll always all probably remember the beast from the east. So then looking at hypothermia, obviously sort of mismothering, a yow that wanders off and leaves the lamb, those lambs can be very, very susceptible to sort of cold weather exposure and things like that. And that's another high reason for sort of death in young lambs. So, as I said, mismothering is a major cause of starvation, which in turn can be a cause of hypothermia. Coming across the table, pre-lambing stillbirths, close regular shepherding must be a priority. Pre-lambing stillbirths, which be down to poor nutrition, maybe rough handling, listeriosis, soil contamination, and poor mouldy big bales and things like that, which are commonly fed to sheep. Infections such as Salmonella and Campylobacter. So, and then moving across, other stillbirths could be a result of difficult lambing, birthing injuries, trauma, oxygen, a lamb that's deprived of oxygen. And then we come down to, things like you'll be injecting for sort of watery mouth, navel ill, joint ill. And then if you've got any sort of congenital sort of heart defects and things like that, when the lamb has been being produced inside the yow, those are sort of issues that can also happen and be a cause of stillborn deaths and things like that. So looking at the lamb feeding systems, I'm sure that you're all familiar with these. Looking at the lamb bottle, sort of teated feeder systems, or a U2 or a shepherdess type feeder, or coming on to what Howard's been talking about there with the eco lamb feeder. There are a number of rearing systems out there on the market, but the most important thing, doesn't matter what the system, but whatever the system that you're using, it's dead important to be consistent in everything that you do. If you've got different people feeding the lambs and things like that, it would be important to weigh out the milk replacer, check the temperature of the water that is being mixed into the milk replacer, and being consistent. A well-organized rearing system can save hours and as a result will produce quality lambs. So looking at a bottling system or a bottle feeding, so you certainly do have more control. The amount of milk per lamb will be somewhere between about 8 and 10 kilos of lamb lac used per lamb. It is quite a labour intensive system. You do have a tendency to have reduced growth rates, and that is because in common as on an ad lib system, they will be consuming a lot more milk, and risk of digestive upsets can be increased if you aren't consistent in everything that you do. So again, it's important to make sure that your bottles, your milk is mixed consistently at the right temperature, at the right concentration. Okay. Then moving on to cold ad lib sort of system. So you've got the shepherdess system, that you've got the U2. This is less labor intensive because you're basically mixing up milk in a larger quantity, and overall you're not having to do it, you're not having to do it as often. You've got a relatively low setup cost. We are looking, as it's an ad lib system, you are looking at between about 10 to 12 kilos of milk per lamb that's being used. It's pretty easy to operate, and the beauty of the U2 is that it actually sits outside the pen and uses exactly the same sort of teat setup that Howard's just sort of shown you on farm there. And it is important that the non-return valve sits as close to the teat as possible in the milk line, but ensure that it is in a vertical position so the ball bearing sits and works correctly. So as a general rule, we will see faster growth rates because lambs have got access to ad lib milk. The beauty of this system is that the milk is consumed little and often, which in turn there is less risk of digestive upsets and things like that. It's vitally important to remember that a U2 is not designed to heat the milk up. It is only designed to keep the milk at the desired feeding temperature. So if we're feeding milk at sort of 15 to 20 degrees, we want consistency being used on the right age of those lambs. And then we want the milk put in there at 20 degrees, and if the setting is correct, the U2 feeder will keep the milk at 20 degrees. The other thing is, because you've got milk sitting in there that is being kept warm, it's vitally important that a U2 feeder is cleaned out on a daily basis to ensure that you know, the milk, the fat, the protein and things like that, and the bugs and bacteria don't get in there and start going moldy inside the bucket. So, you know, cleanliness is imperative with these machines, like it is with all feeding systems. So then moving on to an automatic feeder, they are least labour. They do have the fastest growth rates, but they do have a high capital outlay. I think it's fair to say that anybody that is invested in something like an eco feeder, once they've got them, you'll never ever look back. But they do have quite a high, you know, capital outlay and setup cost. So milk consumed on them is very similar to a U2. So it's little and often. You've got a lower risk of digestive upsets because the machine is very consistent in what it does. I've already touched on it's got the higher setup cost, and you will use a little bit more milk per lamb. Again, hygiene is critical, and it's important that the tubes and the mixer must be cleaned on a daily basis. The beauty of this machine, it does have a semi-automatic wash, and is quite a sort of a user-friendly machine to sort of keep clean and things like that. So then, when we look at approximate cost of surplus lamb rearing, of going across the top there, that we are looking on a bottle feed in sort of 8 to 10 kilos of milk, and then coming across to an automatic feeder, we're looking at about 12 to 14 kilos of milk. So your bottom line on your total profit for this presentation, I have solely looked, because there are so many different systems out there, that I have purely looked on the cost of dry feed and on at the cost of the milk replacer. So that's the only things I'm factoring into this. But I think what it's important to remember, that whatever the cost of rearing the lamb, it's important that the yow goes out to grass and she will rear 2 good lambs successfully. So hopefully, you know, if it's triplets, the third lamb that you're putting onto an ad lib system, or whatever the system, that when that yow comes back in, you know, she has successfully reared 2 lambs, and the third lamb, the third lamb is the bonus. So you can see it does vary slightly. A bottle-fed lamb, we know that it uses less milk replacer, and an automatic feeder there uses more milk replacer, so the return on total profit is slightly lower, but it's less labor intensive and things like that, and is a very good way to rear lambs on an ad lib. So looking at this pen here, again, Howard's obviously shown us around a pen. I always like this photograph. We've got well-bedded lambs. We've got creep being sort of put in the middle. This farmer in particular, you know, it's important to make sure that dry feed is being added on a regular basis and keeping it fresh, most importantly. So they're well-bedded, they're draft-free. The bigger view, you can't see these lambs have got access to dry feed. They've got access to straw in a hay rick, and they've also got access to water, which is another important sort of vital nutrient. So what we're looking for when it comes to weaning, lambs should be at a minimum of 2.5 times their birth weight, a minimum of 35 days of age, but most lambs, in fairness, will be ready to wean at about the 35-day age, and they must be ideally consuming at least 250 grams of solid dry feed a day. And weaning is most successfully achieved when lamb lac is withdrawn abruptly, providing that lambs are old enough and they have taken on sufficient dry feed. So why feed lamb lac? Going back to our manufacturing process, we do have a very high quality dairy protein, a CMP as we call it. It's a concentrated milk protein, and it's highly digestible for fast and healthy growth. And Jess will come on about some of her trial work a little bit later on, and sort of she'll go through some daily live weight gains that have been achieved on our lamb milk replacer. It's a specially selected blend of vegetable oils, which is highly digestible, which has excellent stability of a mixed milk, because as already been touched on, that when it goes into the U2 feeders and things like that, sometimes it can sit there for 3 or 4 hours before it gets refilled. So that's vitally important. It is available in an instant or a machine grade milk replacer, so it's suitable for all rearing systems. It's a fixed formulation, consistently provides all the nutrients required for the lambs, and it is tried and tested. Volac Lamlac is just over 50 years old now, so it's a tried and trusted formula. It's available in 10 and 20 kilo bags, will stay fresh when mixed for 24 hours, and it is made using British milk, which in turn is supporting British dairy farmers. So concentrated milk protein, summing up the benefits. So highly digestible for faster growth rates. Ultra filtrated milk protein, coming back to the immunoglobulins with the high amino acid profile. It's natural health protection with a less risk of nutritional upsets. It's instatized, so it can be mixed in cold water, and fully formulated, so it's got all the nutrients required for for a growing lamb. It stays fresh for 24 hours and is excellent in ad-lib systems. So then basically summing up, basically top tips for success. We are very much looking that good management is essential, and as I said at the start, consistency in everything that you do. Be prepared, ensure that you have good quality ample colostrum and that it is fed correctly within the right time frame. That's already been touched on. We've talked about quantities of milk powder, that you're looking between about 8 and 14 kilos of milk dependent on the lamb system. It mixes in cold water. It's important to weigh the lamb milk to ensure and measure the water to make sure you're getting the right concentration. And that would be 800 mils of water with 200 mils of milk replacer, making up a mixed solution at 20%. So it's important to ensure that your feeding equipment is clean. Attention to all of the details above, and together all of those small details will make a really, really big difference. And with all my years of experience going around on farm, which will be 20 plus years, what I would say to you with any feeding system, that ad-lib, especially with ad-lib where they've got access, free access to milk, is when your lambs get to 35 days of age or you're 2.5 times your birth weight, do not kill your lambs with kindness. Many a time we get called out where a lamb has bloated or something like that. We go out and the lambs are 40, 45, 50, even 60 days of age, and it's usually the best lamb that unfortunately that it happens to, and it is a result that the lamb, because milk is readily available, that lamb has bloated itself because it's been greedy. So just be very, very careful, keep an eye on those weights, keep an eye on those dates, and just make sure you don't kill your lambs with kindness. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Jason. I think a really key point for that for me, which I'd not considered before, was, the cost of rearing these surplus lambs is something we get questioned on quite a lot. And it's not a singular lamb that you're rearing. You're allowing that ewe to go out and rear her twins as well, and keep her in good condition while you're rearing that third one indoors. So we're going to whiz straight over to Jessica before we go back to Howard on farm, and then we'll have some questions at the end. So Jessica.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay?
Yep, perfect.
Yes, perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Jessica Cooke, Volac's Research and Development Manager. I'm responsible for the young animal R&D, so this afternoon I'm going to present our latest trial work demonstrating that lambs can be reared well on Lamlac, getting the strong, healthy growth that you would expect from using a high-performance milk formula. So I'm going to present the data to you in two parts this afternoon. So first of all, I'm going to start with the trials that we did in 2020, and then I shall move on to the more recent data from 2021. So first of all, I have got the data from 2020. So we had two trial sites. First of all, we had site 1 was Harper Adams University, and site 2 was a commercial unit in Lancashire. Across both the sites, we were using triplet bearing ewes. So where possible, we were taking the strongest, largest lamb that was being removed from the ewe, with the aim of leaving 2 equal sized lambs on that ewe. So on site 1, we had 13 lambs being fed from a U2 feeder. And on site 2, we had 100 lambs split into 3 pens being fed via an eco feeder, as we've already seen earlier today. All the lambs were being fed Lamlac, which is a 24% crude protein, 24% fat product, and it was being mixed at 20%. So as Jason's just said, this is 200 grams of milk powder made up to a total volume of 1 litre of mixed milk. Across both the sites, we initially fed the milk warm before reducing the temperature. So on site 1, the lamb started off with warm milk at 25 degrees C, and then once all lambs were fully trained and sucking happily from the feeder, we reduced the temperature to 20 degrees for 1 week, and then it was reduced further to 15 degrees through until weaning. On site 2, on the eco feeder, lambs started off with milk at 37 degrees C. Once all the lambs were trained, the temperature was then reduced to 20 degrees C, which it remained at through until weaning. The importance of sort of dropping that temperature down is it's important to really encourage creep intake, because these young lambs being offered very warm milk will simply guzzle it and have low creep intakes. So by knocking that temperature down, we hope to encourage creep intake, which is important for rumen development, and also to reduce the risk of overconsumption. So just a quick bit on the general management across the 2 sites. So as we've heard from Reg, colostrum intake is absolutely vital. So on site 1, they were feeding fresh or stored colostrum via a bottle and teat at 1, 10 and 18 hours after birth. Whereas on site 2, the lambs were actually being left on the ewe for 24 hours to suckle the colostrum. Once the lambs were in their groups and feeding off the feeder, they all had access to ad lib fresh water, creep and forage. And the weaning was the same across both the trial sites. So the lambs were being weaned abruptly at 35 days of age, but we also just wanted them to be a minimum of 2.5 times their birth weight, and also consuming around 250 grams of creep feed per day. So moving on to the results. So the results are presented, you've got 2 parts of the table. First of all, site 1, and then on the right hand side, we've got site 2, and then we've got the mean, minimum, maximum values for the weekly body weights for each of the sites. So overall, all the lambs did extremely well, and they all achieved that sort of 2.5 times their birth weight at weaning on day 35. So looking at these figures in more detail, so you can see that across the 2 sites, at birth, the lambs are weighing sort of 4 to 4.5 kilos on average, ranging from 3 to 6 kilos. By week 2, the lambs were weighing just under 9 kilos. And then at weaning on day 35, on site 1, the lambs weighed on average 17.8 kilos, ranging from 13 to 23. On site 2, the lambs weighed on average 15 kilos, ranging from 10 to 22 kilos. We then use that body weight to calculate the daily live weight gain from birth to weaning. And on site 1, the average daily live weight gain through to weaning was 0.38 kilos per day. And on site 2, it was 0.31 kilos per day. So overall, across both the sites, it shows that lambs did very well and were achieving on average 15 to 18 kilos of body weight at weaning at 35 days of age. And they had average consumptions of around 12 kilos of powder per lamb. So then moving on to the more recent trials that we've done in 2021. So again, we had 2 trial sites. Harper Adams University again was site 1, and then Rees Heath College was site 2. We did the same in terms of recruiting lambs from triplet bearing ewes, and we were removing the largest, strongest lamb with the aim of leaving 2 equal sized lambs on that ewe. On site 1, we had 20 lambs being fed via a U2 feeder, and on site 2, we had 59 lambs being fed from an eco feeder. All the lambs were fed Lamlac again, mixed at 20%. And similar to last time, we started the lambs off at a warmer temperature of milk and then gradually reduced it. So this time on site 1, we started the milk at 25 degrees C. Once all the lambs were trained to feed from that feeder, we then actually reduced the milk temperature more gradually. So we reduced it by 2 degrees every 2 days to get it down to 15 degrees C, where we then held it through until weaning. On site 2, we started the lambs off on warm milk at 25 degrees C. Once they were trained, that temperature got reduced to 20 degrees C for 1 week, and then simply reduced to 15 degrees C through until weaning. The management on these 2 sites was similar again. The only sort of differences was in terms of colostrum management. So for site 1 this time, the lambs were actually all left on the ewe for 24 hours to suckle colostrum, and they were only fed supplementary colostrum via a bottle and teat if they needed it. On site 2, the lambs were left on the ewe for 6 to 10 hours, and then at that point they actually got a second feed of colostrum via a bottle and teat. Again, all the lambs were offered ad lib fresh water, creep and forage, and all the lambs were weaned abruptly at 35 days of age. Moving on to the results, so I've actually split the 2 sites for the results. So these are the results for site 1, so Harper Adams University, where we had the 20 lambs being fed from a U2 feeder. So similar to what we saw before, the average birth weight was around 4 kilos, ranging from just under 3 kilos through to 6 kilos. By week 2, the lambs weighed on average 8.5 kilos. And on day 35 at weaning, lambs were just under 17 kilos on average, ranging from 12 to 23 kilos. This equated to a daily live weight gain from birth to weaning of 0.34 kilos per day. So again, overall very good performance, with lambs achieving on average 17 kilos at weaning on day 35. These lambs did consume a fraction more, so average intakes were around 14 kilos of milk powder per lamb. What we were able to do with this trial as well was to actually capture some of the slaughter data. And these lambs were achieving on average 49 kilos at slaughter at around sort of just under 4.5 months of age. And then finally, the data for the site 2, and it's presented in this table as the 2 pens. So the lambs were divided into 2 pens according to their service date. So pen 1 were the early born lambs born to service 1, and pen 2 were the later born lambs born to the second service. So looking across the 2 pens, at birth, on average, the lambs were weighing 4 to 4.5 kilos, ranging from 3 to 6.5 kilos. By week 2, the lambs were weighing sort of 8 to 9 kilos. And then at week 5 at weaning, the lambs in pen 1 weighed on average 18.5 kilos, and the lambs in pen 2 were weighing on average 15.5 kilos. This gave daily live weight gains from birth to weaning of 0.38 kilos per day for pen 1 and 0.33 kilos per day for pen 2. We weren't able to get the slaughter data for these lambs, but we did manage to get a body weight at 2 months of age, which just enabled us to capture some of that post-weaning daily live weight gain. So at 2 months, the lambs in pen 1 weighed on average 26 kilos, and in pen 2 they were weighing 23 kilos. This equated to a daily live weight gain post-weaning of around 0.3 kilos per day, which very much puts them on track for achieving target slaughter weights of around 40 kilos. So just to sum up some of the sort of key considerations from our trial work, I think it's been highlighted very well from Reg in terms of the importance of colostrum management. You know, we need to get good colostrum intake into them to reduce the risk of mortality and to help improve those growth rates. It's important to consider group size and the number of teats, as we've heard from Howard, and you know, how that relates to actually the competition within that pen. And we would always sort of recommend a maximum of 10 lambs per teat. I've mentioned milk temperature, and as a guide, we would recommend starting lambs off on warm milk at 25 degrees C until those lambs are trained. Once all the lambs are trained and happily sucking from the feeder, then we need to reduce that temperature to 20 degrees C, and if it's practical and possible, reduce it further down to 15 degrees C. The reason for this is to reduce the risk of overconsumption, because those young lambs will guzzle the warm milk, but also it's vitally important to encourage creep feed intake, because if lambs are drinking nice warm milk, and they won't be interested in eating the creep feed. So by just knocking that temperature down, you hope to encourage that creep feed intake and end up with better developed rumens, and actually avoid sort of potential setbacks around weaning, because lambs with low creep feed intakes will stand still at weaning, which is not what we want. And then above all, sort of anything, as we've heard from Jason and Howard, and we'll probably hear some more from Howard shortly, attention to detail and good management is absolutely essential. So we have found that lambs reared on Volacs Lambing weigh on average 15 to 19 kilos at weaning at 35 days of age, and we've shown this across 4 trials over 2 years. Average slaughter weights have been recorded around 49 kilos at 4 to 4.5 months of age. And as we saw from Jason's data, this can result in profits of around 23 to 32 pounds per lamb, depending on the system. But also by removing that third lamb and leaving the ewe with 2 healthy lambs, which in normal conditions should thrive, the pressure on that ewe is reduced, helping to improve the longevity of the flock. So with good management, lambs can be successfully reared artificially on Volacs Lambing, helping to maximise the number of lambs reared, as well as improving flock longevity. Thank you very much. Back over to you, Sam.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just to let everybody on the call know that, as Jason said, Lamlac's been in the marketplace for over 50 years, but that doesn't mean that we stand still. Here at Volac, we never stand still, and we're always doing various trials and making sure that our products are still modern. So Josh is just sharing a video for us that they took while I believe Jessica was speaking. So Josh, hopefully we can get the audio to work on this. No audio, I'm afraid. Nope, no problem. Josh, did you want to take us back live to Howard then, if we can't get the audio? What was Howard saying in that field full of the lambs that went out earlier in the year?
Welcome back.
Hello.
That east wind is still blowing, so I'm coming out into the shed to get out of the way. Something I wanted to show you that is relevant to any of you that are doing teat feeding. A little tip we picked up. We saw earlier how the angle of these is just right. If we look at the front of these teats, and you can see in the training pens everybody's on a white teat. There's a little tip with these which I'd love to share with you. And some of you I know, but when you're setting these in, try and set the teat so it finishes up with the hole as a plus sign, not a times sign. There's a very real reason for that, because if you set it as a plus sign, when the lamb squeezes it, the gap opens those few bits of a mil wider and makes it easier for the lamb to drink. That is absolutely deliberate in the construction and the setting of the cross itself. So remember that one if you can. Set it as a plus sign rather than a times sign. And that applies on any teat, on any feeding system. It will open that little bit wider if you set it as a plus rather than a times. And we can see here these lambs, I mentioned before how well they're doing. And the farm here record weights regularly. They take a sample from here. Every week they weigh them. And I'm happy to tell you the unit average is very close to 300 grams. 300 grams a day, and we've been able to work out from the current sample, we've got everything between 430 grams and 150 grams. So we've got a real range of weights going on here. And you can see how they arrive at their average. But the fact that they're recording those weights is the really important part, because they'll know where their weights are going. And this year, like everything else, it's fair to say that it's just a little bit average, just a little bit average. Looking at this system, I know a lot of folk, and they will be concerned here, because at the farm we're almost done lambing. These pens will be full, and that's the point at which we can start to consider the temperatures at which we're feeding. Now, this is completely different to calves in that we work much cooler. Lambs are quite happy to drink ad lib milk cooler. And if we just have a look at the manual setting on here, and I go to temperature, you can see that at temperature we're set at 27 degrees. That's plenty warm enough, guys. What will happen within a week? Lambing will be over here, the pens will be fully stocked, and it will be possible after a few days to start to reduce that temperature. And one of the beauties of having a machine like this is we can take it down gradually, a degree a day, to ease the temperature. And that's really crucial when lambs are drinking ad lib. That will control the amount that each lamb drinks, and more importantly, make the weaning process easier. So as the days go on, the farm will start to cool the milk down. You'll notice that we've got some short teats and we've got some long teats, and the short ones will be removed. We will stay with the long lines so that those lambs find it more difficult to drink, cooler milk. It will help the weaning process. And that's what we're after now. Once you can see how well reared these lambs are, the crucial thing next is weaning. And to manage that weaning process, we cool the milk and make it a little more difficult for them to drink. We don't change the concentration because that just encourages more milk to be drunk. What we want to do is cool that down so that it's a nice, steady, gradual move away. But I can't emphasize enough just how important it is to provide water, clean water, fresh starter food. Look, that's pen. Not everyone's got a feeder like that, but there's no way the lambs can get in and foul that. And it's going to be really easy for them to learn to eat starter feed. Look how enthusiastic they are for straw. It's not hay. Hay adds to the complication of the digestion. Remember, they're taking lots of high protein milk. They've got a high pro starter feed. They need something to balance that out. That's what the straw does.
Can we go over what you said in the field?
Let's go and have a look over here. Do you remember when we first came in? There was a lamb and 2 ewes there, even a ewe and 2 lambs there. They've moved. Policy on the farm.
Josh, we've lost a bit of sound.
Yes, she's got a hay, she's got a water. The lambs are away. She's got an excellent udder. They're already suckling. The farm know that these lambs have already had their colostrum. But it's interesting that as policy, any 3s here receive supplementary colostrum as standard. And that's a really important part of the rearing process here and why they rear such a high percentage of lambs. We can see we've got others ready to go out. The conditions, as you saw before, are so good outside. As soon as these ewes and lambs have recovered from the birthing process, they'll be off outside.
So Howard, Josh tried to share a video earlier of you stood in the field with those lambs that went out earlier. Are you able to tell us what you were going to tell us in that? Because the tech let us down, unfortunately.
Oh, that's a shame. What I was going to show, what was remarkable was the walk itself and how on heavy Essex clay, Josh, I hope he won't mind you telling, he's got his best trainers on. He could have gone out there in carpet slippers. It's so dry. You can walk on heavy Essex clay in carpet slippers, but that's fantastic if you're turning out ewes and lambs. We could see how well the grass, there's a good covering of grass there even now. They're absolutely thriving. The eldest ones have been out there since the 2nd week of the month, and they're doing really, really well. And I can only hope that those conditions in that respect are replicated for those of you who are still to lamb, because that's one good thing about it being as dry as it is. I hope there'll be some moisture so the grass will grow on. But here this year, it's been exceptionally easy to turn lambs out. It's not always possible to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of you. Now, I've had a few questions come in, which I've hurriedly been collating here. So hopefully everybody can hear us, and Howard, you can hear us on farm. But I've had one in Reg, I'm going to aim this one at you. I've got here, how long should colostrum be fed for? And then that's a two-part question, but if you answer that, I've got another bit as well.
Hello. So when we feed colostrum, ideally you'll be on the ewe. So once you've started taking colostrum down from the ewe, that colostrum will then start changing into actual milk. So that's the kind of natural process. If we had lambs that we'd taken off the ewe, then we'd want to feed them colostrum for at least the first 18-24 hours. We could feed colostrum after that, but we'll get less benefit from it, so it might be worth just saving the colostrum for lambs that really need it. So I would turn on to milk after 24 hours.
Brilliant. And the second part to that question was, is there a colostrum supplement that you think is better than others, or what's the option when colostrum's in short supply?
So I don't tend to give product details. The best thing you can do is milk out surplus colostrum from ewes and freeze it. I tend to freeze it in yogurt pots in about 50 ml aliquots. They're easy to defrost. You only have to pop them in a kind of a warm bath and they'll defrost within about 20 minutes. Don't boil them, don't put them in the microwave, it'll turn into cottage cheese and you can't get that down a tube. But honestly, if you have a ewe that's really, really milky, milk about 50 ml extra out of her and put that in the freezer.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So a couple more questions I've got here is, how is it best to manage milk feeding temperatures when you've got a mix of lamb ages? Howard, I think you covered that a little bit, but has anybody else got any comments on that?
I'll take this one, Sam, or
Jessica?
start the ball rolling. I think that is the biggest challenge when you've got a big age range, and most big commercial units will have a big age range of lambs. But, you know, I think the best bit of advice is to start the temperature off warm at 25 degrees C and once your youngest, most vulnerable lamb is away and fully trained, which should only sort of take 2 to 3 days to get them trained, then start to reduce that temperature. And I think as an absolute minimum, get it down to 20 degrees C, because then that's kind of a happy medium. So then if you've got some of your older lambs, it's not too warm for them, but it's still warm enough for some of those younger lambs coming through the system. And as we saw, I think on the farm with Howard, the other option is to actually change the length of your tubes so the milk's got further to travel, so it'll actually be cooler by the time it gets to those older lambs in the further away pen. So keep your youngest lambs close to the feeder so they get the warm milk, and then some of your older lambs further away.
Brilliant, thank you. Any more comments on that before I move on to the next one? No, excellent. I've had one here that in the dairy industry we step wean calves. What's the best reason, or sorry, we step wean calves. How do we wean lambs, or why do we wean abruptly? Jason, one for you.
Jess,
I can take it.
yeah, go on. Yeah.
I mean, yes, we do gradually wean calves, but actually with lambs, the best way is abrupt weaning because it just reduces the risk of digestive upsets. And I think Jason touched on it in his presentation that those older lambs will continue to guzzle milk and gorge, and that's when you can run into risk of sort of bloat problems. And especially with if you're trying to gradually wean a lamb, if you try and remove a feed, when you do then offer milk, it will then guzzle it down, which then runs the risk of bloat. So you're much better as soon as they get to sort of day 35 and they are 2.5 times their birth weight, just to simply lift them out of that pen as long as they're eating the creep, because it just minimizes the risk of those digestive upsets, which you can run into if you try to sort of gradually wean a lamb. And I think ultimately it's a more practical system as well to lift them out, as opposed to trying to reduce the amount of milk being offered to them.
Brilliant. So I've got two more here, one of which is, when rearing lambs on a milk replacer at weaning, should you turn them straight out onto the grass? As Howard said, the ground out there is suitable, or would you finish inside on a creep feed inside?
The table that I shared let me get it up in front of me. The table that I shared looking at the amount of dry feed, and I can't just get, so looking at, come on, Jason, 40 kilos of feed, we would be looking at finishing those lambs in the pen and not giving them access to grass. I think we can go out there, you'll get a number of different opinions out there, but me personally, with my experience and what I've picked up over the years, that lambs on creep feed after milk in a building will sell, and they will fetch good prices. There used to be a bit of a stigma attached to a caged lamb, things like that, but across the board, well-reared lambs will fetch 85, 90 quid, and sometimes even 100 quid. So yeah, indoors for me. But
Brilliant.
I would just follow up on that, Sam. Very much agree with that, and I think we found that in our trials and working with the different sites. They've said that actually the lambs are so much better if you keep them indoors. Once they've been weaned, keep them on the creep, it just keeps them going and keeps that growth going. Whereas if you turn them out too soon, that's when you run into problems, and they will stand still and suffer sort of setbacks. So just to keep that growth going, you're much better off keeping them inside on creep for a bit longer.
And the amount of dry feed, you're looking at about 75 kilos a lamb. So that was what my costings were done indoors, intensively reared.
Excellent. And the question that I know we get asked as Volac quite a lot is, which lamb would you recommend artificially rearing if you've got triplets or even quads?
Always pick off the smallest lamb or lambs and send the yow out with the two strongest lambs.
I think the key thing as well is to try and leave two equally sized lambs on that ewe. I think is what you want to make sure, that the two that are left on the ewe are equal sized.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. So before we close, I thought we'd just whiz back to the farm. Josh has told me that all the sheep have just been fed, so it's pretty loud. So what's going on there at the moment, Josh and Howard?
Well, if you can hear in the background or not hear me, it's because it's feeding time. It's lunchtime for the ewes. You can hear them. There's nowhere near as many in the shed as there were just a few weeks ago. And you can see those at the back are feeding readily. The noise levels have gone up here considerably. Also feeding still happily are these lambs in here. My takeaway one for you today is, don't be afraid to look after them. Make a fuss, make the water, keep the starter feed clean, set those teats like we said, and your lamb rearing will improve, and you'll improve that area of weaning. They are difficult creatures to wean so much milk, but if you can moderate that and make that transition as smooth as possible, your weaning and your subsequent lamb development is going to go so much better. I wish every single one of you who's got lamb the very smoothest and as smooth and successful as it can be.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Howard and Josh on farm. With thanks to Jessica and Jason as well, and very special thanks to Wedge for joining us all the way from Scotland. And yeah, good luck with lambing, and the recording will be available. Any questions or queries that you have, please feel free to email lambing@volac.com. But otherwise, that's all from us, I believe.